For more than 3 decades, Johnny Carson sat behind The Tonight Show desk as America's most trusted late-night voice, listening carefully while Hollywood's biggest stars revealed just enough to keep audiences hooked. But what many viewers never realized was that Carson often knew far more than he ever said out loud. In an era when careers could be destroyed overnight by a single rumor, secrets were currency, and Johnny Carson guarded them fiercely. Behind the laughter, the applause, and the perfectly timed punchlines, there were unspoken truths that never made it to air. Over the years, Carson hinted, sometimes subtly, sometimes through private conversations, that several of his most famous guests were living double lives. These were performers adored by millions, men whose public images were carefully crafted to fit a conservative Hollywood system that left no room for honesty about who they loved. Carson, known for his discretion, chose silence over scandal, believing it was not his place to expose what society refused to accept. Only after his death did stories begin to surface from close friends, writers, and insiders who claimed Carson had quietly acknowledged the truth about certain guests long before the public ever caught on. These were not shocking confessions made on camera, but quiet acknowledgments shared behind closed doors. This is not about outing anyone for shock value, it's about understanding the cultural pressure of old Hollywood, the price of fame, and the compassion Carson showed by keeping secrets that, at the time, could have ruined lives. Johnny Carson didn't become the king of late-night television by accident. He earned that position by understanding people better than almost anyone else in Hollywood. Long before cameras rolled each night, Carson paid close attention to what guests said, what they avoided, and how carefully they guarded certain parts of their lives. In an industry built on illusion, he learned to read between the lines. And in old Hollywood, some lines were never meant to be crossed publicly. During the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, being openly gay was not just controversial, it was dangerous. Studio contracts often included morality clauses that could end a career instantly. Publicists constructed fake romances, arranged dates, and even staged photographs to reinforce a heterosexual image. For many male stars, survival depended on silence. Johnny Carson understood this reality better than most, because he watched it unfold night after night from just a few feet away, according to biographers and former Tonight Show staff members. Carson was privately aware that several of his frequent guests were gay, even as their public images suggested otherwise. These were not one-time appearances, but men who returned again and again, trusting Carson to keep the focus on their work rather than their personal lives. Carson reportedly never pressed them about marriage, dating, or family unless they introduced the topic themselves. At the time, this seemed like simple professionalism. Years later, it began to look like deliberate protection. One of the first signs of Carson's awareness was how he handled humor. Late-night television often relied on jokes that poked at masculinity, relationships, and traditional gender roles. Carson could have easily leaned into that style. Instead, he kept his humor broad and non-specific, avoiding jokes that would corner a guest or feed existing rumors. Writers later recalled that Carson occasionally rejected jokes that felt too personal, even if they guaranteed a big laugh. Behind the scenes, Carson's conversations were very different from what viewers saw on television. Insiders claimed that off-camera discussions were often quiet, respectful, and surprisingly empathetic. Carson reportedly spoke about certain guests with a tone that suggested understanding rather than curiosity or judgment. There was no sense of scandal in these private acknowledgments, only acceptance of a reality everyone pretended not to see. It's important to understand the power Carson held. At his peak, appearing on The Tonight Show could boost ticket sales, revive careers, and shape public perception overnight. Carson could have used that power to hint, tease, or expose. Other media figures sometimes did exactly that. Carson didn't. His silence was not ignorance. It was a choice. Some critics argue that this silence contributed to a culture of hiding. Others believe it gave performers the breathing room they needed to survive in an unforgiving industry. What's clear is that Carson operated within a system he did not create. Openly challenging it would have required a kind of public confrontation that simply didn't exist on network television at the time. Carson's own life may have shaped his thinking. He experienced multiple marriages, personal turmoil, and long stretches of emotional distance from those closest to him. Friends later suggested that these struggles made him less interested in judging how others lived. To Carson, what mattered most was whether a guest was talented, professional, and honest about their work, even if they couldn't be honest about everything else. By the time cultural attitudes slowly began to shift, many of the men Carson quietly protected were already near the end of their careers. For them, coming out publicly offered little reward and enormous risk. Carson seemed to understand that timing mattered. In the wrong era, truth could destroy rather than liberate. This sets the foundation for the larger story. Johnny Carson didn't reveal names, didn't make announcements, and didn't force confessions. But according to those who knew him best, he knew far more than he ever said, and that knowledge shaped how he treated some of the most famous guests in television history. As the cultural landscape slowly shifted in the late 1970s and 1980s, rumors that once stayed buried behind studio walls began to leak into public conversation. Tabloids grew bolder, gossip columns gained influence, and audiences became more curious about the private lives of celebrities. Yet even as speculation increased, The Tonight Show remained a controlled environment. Johnny Carson understood that his desk was one of the few places where a guest could still feel relatively safe. Former producers later recalled that some guests arrived visibly tense, worried less about promoting a movie and more about avoiding an accidental slip of the tongue. Carson noticed these anxieties immediately. Rather than exploiting them, he adjusted. Conversations were steered toward craft, early career struggles, or light humor. Personal questions were softened or avoided altogether. This was not accidental hosting, it was intentional restraint. Privately, Carson was said to acknowledge that certain guests lived lives that didn't match their public narratives. These acknowledgments were never dramatic revelations. They were quiet, matter-of-fact understandings shared with close friends or longtime staff. According to those accounts, Carson didn't view these men as secrets waiting to be exposed. He viewed them as professionals trapped in a system that demanded dishonesty for survival. The pressure on these performers was enormous. Studio executives feared backlash from advertisers. Networks worried about conservative audiences. Even fellow actors sometimes distanced themselves to avoid guilt by association. In this climate, Carson's discretion became invaluable. A single careless joke or suggestive remark on national television could ignite speculation that spiraled out of control. Carson refused to be that spark. What made his approach unusual was consistency. He didn't selectively protect only the most powerful stars. If a guest seemed uncomfortable, Carson adapted regardless of their fame level. Writers later admitted that some jokes were quietly killed minutes before airtime if Carson felt they crossed an invisible line. Ratings mattered, but not at the expense of someone's dignity. This behavior earned Carson a reputation that rarely made headlines, but traveled quickly through Hollywood. Performers knew that if they sat across from Johnny Carson, they would be treated fairly. That trust explains why so many guests returned repeatedly over decades. They weren't just promoting projects, they were maintaining a relationship with the most influential host in television. Today, some argue that silence equals complicity. It's a valid debate. But judging Carson by modern standards ignores the reality of network television at the time. Open discussions of sexuality were not framed as liberation, they were framed as controversy. Carson's job was not activism. It was navigation. And he navigated carefully. Several of the men rumored to be among the 9 continued to appear on Carson's show well into the later years of their careers. Their continued presence suggests something important. They trusted him. In an industry where trust was rare and exposure was constant, that mattered more than public acknowledgement. Carson's silence also reflected a deeper belief about boundaries. He reportedly felt that an audience was entitled to entertainment, not confession. If a guest chose to reveal something personal, Carson would listen. If they didn't, he believed it was not his role to force it into the spotlight. As public attitudes continued to evolve, the gap between what Carson knew and what he said grew wider. But he held that line until the end. Understanding this mindset is crucial, because it explains why, even with enormous power, Johnny Carson never publicly revealed the truths he privately understood. After Johnny Carson stepped away from The Tonight Show in 1992, the carefully controlled world he had ruled for 3 decades began to change rapidly. New hosts pushed boundaries, celebrity culture became more invasive, and personal revelations slowly turned into a form of entertainment. As this shift unfolded, people who had worked closely with Carson started to reflect on how different his approach truly was. Only then did the weight of what he knew, and chose not to say, become clear. Former writers and producers described Carson as someone who rarely spoke carelessly in private. When the subject of certain guests came up, his comments were brief and deliberate. He never framed their sexuality as gossip or scandal. Instead, he spoke with a tone that suggested long-standing awareness. According to these accounts, Carson often expressed quiet frustration with Hollywood's double standards, where studios profited from talent while forcing performers to hide essential parts of themselves. What's striking is how consistent these stories are. Different insiders, interviewed years apart, described the same pattern. Carson knew, Carson understood, and Carson stayed silent. There were no dramatic deathbed confessions, no written lists, and no public acknowledgments. The idea that he revealed anything comes not from grand statements, but from the accumulation of quiet confirmations shared after his passing. As time went on, historians and biographers began revisiting the careers of several classic entertainers who had been frequent Carson guests. With modern context, clues that once seemed invisible became obvious. Carefully avoided questions, vague references to personal life, and an absence of traditional family narratives all took on new meaning. In many of these moments, Carson's role appeared almost protective. He never pushed where others might have. Some of the men believed to be among the nine eventually found limited freedom later in life, when cultural attitudes softened. Others never did. For them, secrecy became permanent, not by choice, but by necessity. Carson's silence in those cases may have been the only barrier between a successful career and public humiliation. It's difficult to measure the impact of what never happened, but insiders suggest it was significant. There is also an emotional layer to this story that often gets overlooked. Carson himself was known to be guarded, even distant, in his personal relationships. He valued privacy deeply and reportedly resented intrusion into his own life. That personal boundary likely influenced how he treated others. To Carson, protecting someone's private truth may have felt like basic decency rather than moral courage. Critics today sometimes argue that visibility could have accelerated change. That may be true, but it's also true that visibility without protection can destroy lives. Carson understood the risks better than most. He wasn't operating in theory, he was watching real careers rise and fall in real time. By the time of his death in 2005, society had begun to reevaluate the cost of forced secrecy in Hollywood. Stories once whispered were now openly discussed. Against that backdrop, Carson's long silence started to look less like avoidance and more like a reflection of the impossible choices faced by public figures in earlier decades. Johnny Carson didn't live long enough to see full cultural acceptance, but he lived long enough to see the beginnings of change. Those who knew him best believe he understood that history would eventually tell these stories, just not on his stage, and not on his terms. Looking back at Johnny Carson's legacy, it becomes clear that his influence extended far beyond comedy or late-night television. He wasn't just a host. He was a gatekeeper in an industry obsessed with image control. If he truly understood the private lives of 9 famous guests, what defines his legacy is not the knowledge itself, but how he handled it. In an era driven by exposure and speculation, Carson chose restraint. Modern audiences often ask whether silence helped or harmed progress. It's an important question, but one that can't be answered without context. During Carson's reign, honesty about sexuality was rarely framed as courage. It was framed as controversy, scandal, or moral failure. Carson knew that once a truth was spoken on national television, it could never be taken back. Careers could collapse overnight, and the damage would be permanent. What makes Carson's approach stand out is that he never positioned himself as a moral authority. He didn't lecture audiences or make grand statements. Instead, he exercised control quietly. His desk became a place where performers could promote their work without fear of being cornered. For many guests, that safety was rare and invaluable. Some of the men connected to these stories have since been re-examined by historians and biographers with greater honesty and compassion. Their talent now stands apart from the secrecy that once defined their public lives. Carson's role in that history remains subtle but significant. By not forcing disclosure, he allowed their work to speak louder than rumors. There's also a broader lesson in Carson's restraint. In today's media culture, where personal revelation is often treated as entertainment, his choices feel almost foreign. Carson believed there was a line between public interest and personal ownership. Crossing that line, he felt, was not journalism, it was intrusion. It's easy to imagine an alternate history where Carson used implication, jokes, or accidental questions to boost ratings. He never did. That decision likely cost him easy laughs and sensational headlines. But it earned him something more enduring: trust. Performers returned to his show because they knew he wouldn't betray them. In the end, Johnny Carson didn't reveal 9 names, publish a list, or make a final confession. What he revealed instead, through decades of consistent behavior, was a philosophy. He believed people deserved control over their own stories, especially in a world determined to take that control away. As time passes, history continues to fill in the gaps Carson left behind. Truths once hidden are now understood within their cultural context. And when those stories are told, Johnny Carson remains a quiet presence in the background, not as the man who exposed secrets, but as the man who chose not to.